Hi guys, if you're new here, my name is Sam and I make videos about makeup, chronic illness, whatever I want, and today I'm ranking my melt palettes. This is actually really difficult. I knew going into it it would be difficult, but this actually took me multiple hours of, moving them around because some of them I sort of ranked in the same, so I really had to narrow down where they were going to go on the list. So I thought it would be fun to do a really in-depth ranking review for myself where I used every shade in every palette before I actually ranked these. So for the last week and a half, the only shadows I've been using are melt palettes. Not today. Today I am using something different, but I was able to use every shade in each one of these palettes to really inform my ranking. When I was trying them, I would rank them out of 10. I have little notes here explaining why I ranked things the way that I did. I also filmed myself using all of these palettes and all of the shades, and I'll be inserting clips as I talk about it, explaining how each shade performed, if anything stood out, if I noticed fallout, etc. And I'm excited to share. I'm going to be ranking these from least favorite to most favorite, and I will say I do love all of these palettes in one way or another. Ranking it lower on the list doesn't mean I don't enjoy it and I want to get rid of it. It just means if I had to make the decision on what the only one I could own is, that is kind of how I made these choices. Okay, the first palette on the list is Melt Radioactive. So this is going to be number 11 on my list and the least favorite. This is a really fun color story, and looking at it just makes me so excited and happy because it just screams summer, it screams party, it screams just, I don't know, light up your life, pride kind of situation. And when I got this palette, there were a lot of people who said like this was their least favorite. They didn't really like it for one way or for one reason or another. And I was kind of confused because I really like this palette. However, when I stacked it up against my other palettes, it just didn't really live up to the quality of the others. Melt is unfortunately one of those brands who doesn't have a consistent formula, which is disappointing because you never know what you're gonna get. And while I don't dislike anything I own and I do use them all regularly, I do wish they were all the same formula and just as consistent as like when they do good, they do really good. And I wish this formula was that. So there's a lot of fallout in this palette. It's very dusty, which is kind of a melt thing I noticed as I was going through. Like, I guess I never really paid attention to how dusty they were until I was really having to like write pros and cons of every palette I was using. It's definitely a palette you have to do your eyes first before you do your base makeup, or you're just going to have to fix all of your base. Seems like, at least in some lighting, all of these shades have like a light shimmer to them, or some seem to have more than others. Like this yellow shade Neon has quite a bit looking at it. But they all have some kind of light sparkle, which I assume has something to do with helping it blend. I've heard ColourPop say that's why they make those shades with some shimmer in them, is helps with blendability or something. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of that personally. Think you can make blendability just fine without the little sparkle particles. Shockingly, the orange and the yellow are the least vibrant shades in the palette. They look fairly vibrant in the pan, but once you get them on the eyes, they're just kind of a very muted, toned down version of yellow and orange. Even when you build them up, like all these other ones get way more vibrant the more you add. So it starts vibrant and you can just build up the vibrancy by layering. It does not happen with the orange and the yellow. It just kind of stays a very muted version, which is pretty disappointing. However, this is an incredibly fun palette. I'm glad I own it, but that is why we are ranked at number 11. Number 10 is 420. It's actually a little sad that I had to put this so far down on the list, but you know, we have to be a little cutthroat here. I was super excited about This palette, name and color story. The name, first of all, is how many times do you get to buy an eyeshadow palette that just has your birthday on the front. The color story is so fun when you look at it. It's like a warm fall palette. It looks like a harvest festival, and I love that. So I will preface this by saying that there were a few shades that at first I thought I was having trouble with, but I quickly realized it was the type of brush I was using. So I generally use natural hair brushes. It's just kind of what I learned to make up with and what I've been using. But I'm finding most shadows perform better with synthetic, probably because they're formulated to work with synthetic brushes, as most people are cruelty-free these days. So I have some notes where I was struggling with a few of these shades, but once I switched to a synthetic brush, that I did a little better. Now I will say there are some shades in general that perform better with natural hair, so if you're ever struggling with a shade and you have both kinds of brushes, switch back and forth and see if that helps at all. So my first note is Roll It, which is the darkest brown, was pretty patchy, but once I switched to a synthetic brush, it started blending out just fine. Wax, the bright yellow, and Shotgun, which is more of like a pea green, like a neon pea green, are almost the exact same color once you get them on the eye, which is really disappointing because I really wish those two colors just made a statement, but they kind of blend into the same thing. So if you're trying to use them together, it's not going to work so well because they look practically identical. Shatter, which is the only shimmer, is pretty cute, but it definitely reminds me more of a topper than a shimmer. It's not very impactful, but it does complement the other colors really well. It's also not opaque, which there are a lot of people who will have these complaints with some other melt palettes that the shimmers aren't super impactful. And I love an impactful shimmer, as you can tell by my eye look today, or if you're a regular watcher, you know I have some pretty sparkly eyes, but every once in a while I do just like that shimmer topper shade, so I'm not super mad about it. However, I do wish, with it being the only shimmer in the palette, that there was something more punchy here. Like I mentioned with Radioactive, and I'm sure if I'm not showing you something else right now, you can see all of this powder in here. This is a very soft palette. There's a lot of kick up and a lot of dust. So this is another one where you absolutely need to do your eyes first. This color story will always draw my eyes and make me just feel warm and fuzzy, but the execution with the formula is not my favorite from Melt, so that's why she's at number 10. Number 9 is actually going to shock most people who know me because I was so excited to get this palette. It's such a beautiful palette and I have so many good things to say about it, but it's Marte. My mouth doesn't make the correct shapes to pronounce things like this properly. I'm incredibly sorry to all the Spanish-speaking individuals. This color story is absolutely everything, and I can't express how obsessed I am with it. But the shade Katrina, which is the sparkly blue, is a total dud. It is one of the most embarrassing shades I've ever seen in an eyeshadow palette, and it hurts me to say that, but it's bad. It's really bad, and it being the only blue shimmer in here, it's embarrassing, honestly. I really don't like that once you get it on the eye, it's the same exact color as the other two blues, so it just disappears. It isn't an impactful shimmer. It's very hard pressed. It isn't very opaque, so you're just getting not just a monochrome look, it's just a very flat look. There's no dimension. So saying that, you only really get two looks in this palette. You get a teal look and you get a red look. Angelito is a very sticky feeling shimmer, and I have a feeling it's going to get hard pan one day, which is pretty disappointing. And I love the look that I created with the reds, and I'm going to say Calica, but I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is beautiful, but when you pair it with the reds, you get a very like Christmassy look, which is great if you're going for Christmas, but it really limits when you can use this palette. I feel like you can create two beautiful looks with this, and that is about it. And for that reason, it has to be number 9, because Other palettes I can create way more looks with, and this is kind of a one-trick pony. Number 8 is actually my very first melt palette I've ever owned, and it is Smoke Sessions. This was incredibly popular and got restocked for the second time on my birthday, which is 4/20, and I fell in love with this. I heard people rave about this palette so much, and if you look at it, these shimmers are just out of this world, so I can absolutely understand. Unfortunately, this palette has had endless quality control issues. People have puffed up shades, people have shades breaking, crumbling. It's a hot mess. Thankfully, I got one from a batch and it's holding up just fine, but I can understand why people would not want to take a chance buying this palette. The other thing is, you have 2 mats. So you can't exactly use this well as a standalone palette. It is very much a companion palette unless, you know, you just want one look with the cool greens, one look with the warm greens, which is fine. I personally think this pairs really well with a couple of their other palettes, so I don't mind that it's a companion palette. But for that reason, I cannot rank it any higher. Also, as you saw when I held it up, it is Crumble City. It's very messy. Another palette you absolutely need to do your eyes first. And I will say I'm getting into this lifestyle where most of the time I am just doing my eyes first unless it's a look like today. That's fairly neutral. That's not going to make a big mess on my face, but you can see I do have glitter fallout in some instances. So this was number 8. Number 7 is one of the ones that ended up costing me some time because I was not sure where I wanted to put it, and it is Mary Jane. It might shock some people that I ranked this higher than a couple of the other ones because this is a very controversial palette. Not because of the name or anything like that, but because the shimmers are very divisive. This palette is incredibly new to my collection. I just got it a few months ago, and the more I use it, the more I love it. The key to the shimmers for me is glitter glue. It can't just be a primer. It can't just be your finger. It needs to be a glitter glue primer and your finger to really get these to pop. The 2 end shades, Mary Jane and Kali, are more of toppers, so they're a lot more sheer, they're not very opaque, and they're not super impactful. But like I had mentioned in 420, sometimes I really like that look. And the Mary Jane shade is like this bronze with a green twist, which is really pretty layered over one of the browns. There is a lot of fallout with the shimmers in this palette. A lot. They're very crumbly. I also don't like that once they're on the eye, the differences between the mid-tone browns in the mattes are indistinguishable from each other unless you're super up close. One end is supposed to be slightly warmer than the other, like the left half is warmer leaning than the right half, and you're supposed to be able to mix and match, but once you get them on the eye, you truly can't tell the difference unless you're super close to the eye, which sort of defeats the purpose because most people aren't going to be that close to your face. You do get a bit of a deeper look on one end of the palette than the other, but it's such a small difference that I'm not really going to count that as being successful. So this is kind of reminding me a bit of Urban Decay Naked, the original, which will always have a special place in my heart, so I'm glad to have something else like that, but that is why Mary Jane is number 7. Number 6 is a palette that has also had a little bit of controversy. I guess that's kind of a thing with Melt, and it is the Gemini 2. First, we need to address the elephant in the room of people having issues with what looks like mold in their palette. I guess Melt has tested these palettes, and it is wax bloom, not mold. But you can understand why that would freak people out when you see these little white dots that look like mold. They're wax blooms. The pinks in this palette stand alone really well. It's a beautiful palette to look at. It's very pleasing to the eye. And one thing that I really appreciate is you might think, based on some of the comments I've had with the other palettes, that once all of these pinks get on the eye, it's a bit redundant and they start to look the same. Each of these pinks hold their own. You see each of them. They blend together beautifully, but you can still see each different tone. And I absolutely love that. However, I do dislike that the shimmer for the pink part is incredibly dark. Generally, most people like to do a lighter shimmer than the eye unless they're doing like a smoky eye. And I could see how you might want to do a smoky eye with this palette, but most of the tones are incredibly light, so it doesn't make sense to have a shimmer that is one of the darkest colors for the pinks. So that's a huge miss for me. The greens perform beautifully, and that green shade, even though it's deeper, it definitely stands out. It definitely works well with the two matte greens. Now, I understand the regular Gemini is more of a green tone palette, but I wish they would have removed one of the matte pinks or peaches and given us another green as well. And this palette would have been ranked much higher if they had. So that is number 6. Number 5 is incredibly new to my collection. I bought this off a friend because she had an extra, and I wasn't convinced at first because she looks quite boring when you see a picture of her. She probably looks quite boring when I show her to you, but she is magical, and that is the brunette palette. This looks so boring, and while it is a basic palette, it is one of the most beautiful basic palettes I have ever used. Buff, the lightest peach shade, kind of blends directly into my skin tone, but I'm not complaining about that because it makes it great to buff edges. I love having a shade like that around because buffing the edges just really makes your look come together that much more. Suede, the cream, looks like it might be dusty, and on some skin tones it might be, but for me it's a beautiful inner corner highlight. I don't often do a matte inner corner highlight, but sometimes the look calls for it and it's just out of this world. I really like the shimmers in this palette. Like, they don't look that impressive, but once you actually start using them, you're like, what is this sorcery? Musk, the champagne color, will shock you because in the pan, it looks like it's just going to be a kind of a topper shade, but it is probably my favorite shade out of the entire palette. Again, it's a smaller palette. The tones kind of look the same. It's not super exciting, but this is just gorgeous on the eyes, and I think it's perfect basic palette, which everyone needs at least one of, and so that is how she earned the number 5 spot. It kind of surprised me when I was ranking these that I ranked this one higher than its sister. Number 4 is the Vita palette. This palette is just not opening. It's just so much fun. Look at how much fun that is. I can't get enough of it. It works so well. I also love how much can just be done with this palette, honestly. You can have so many colorful looks, but you can also pull out a neutral look as well. And this is that super good melt formula that I mentioned from Gemini 2 that we all love, and it has us coming back to Melt to try each and every one of their releases to see if it's going to be this formula or not. One complaint is these two green shades are one's kind of like a more yellowy green shade. They have that issue where once they're on the eye, they are indistinguishable and they look exactly the same, which is quite disappointing. I wish one of them was a little darker to create some depth. That's just how I like to apply eyeshadow. I like to be able to have a gradient. I do like that you get that depth in the red side, or the red-orange side, I should say. But because there are 4 shades on that end, we only get matte browns, and so we don't get any kind of shimmer for our neutral look, which it's okay to have an all matte look. I'm not opposed to it, but I really wish that every section got its complete package. However, I understand the browns are not the star of the show in this palette. They are just a nice little bonus. I would have ranked this a bit higher. I gave it an 8.5 out of 10 instead of a 9, just because those two greens are practically the same color. But that was number 4. And I don't know if you guys know what all melt palettes I have. I have a couple extra from when I did my palette collection, if you have watched that, but leave in the comments what you think my number 1 is going to be now that we're in the top 3. Number 3 is She's in Parties. This was a lot of people's favorite palette of the year, and I completely understand why. She doesn't have a lot of versatility. She's all purples. However, you do get a warmer side and a cooler side. You can only do basically 2 looks and some variations on those 2 looks. But honestly, that's the only complaint I would have. The formula is amazing. The shimmer is amazing. The tone's amazing. This palette could have been and was ranked higher until I had some thoughts about number 2. So this made it to number 3. Number 2 is, in my opinion, an incredibly slept on hidden gem. And that is the Amor y Mariposas. Please forgive my horrible language skills. I can see why people aren't super fond of this palette. So while I held this up, I learned an interesting fact that I did not know. This is the only palette I have by Melt that was not made in the United States, which could explain why this formula is extra good. It was made in Italy, which makes fabulous eyeshadows if you did not know that. What I was saying is I understand why people did not find the appeal of this palette while looking at it. It is a completely different shape. The pan sizes are round instead of rectangle. The front of the palette, it's not as cute, it's not as pretty, it's a lot less cohesive, I expect. However, what drew me to this specifically is the hummingbirds and the monarchs and what this palette represents in lost loved ones, honoring loved ones, and their spirit coming to visit through monarchs and hummingbirds. I love that. Like, I love the cultural aspect, and also I just think it's a really sweet sentiment and a really fun idea that's pretty unique. Now, I know a lot of people looked at this color story and also felt like it wasn't very Melt-esque. However, I thought this was fun. I have to be honest, I didn't think this appealed to me enough to buy it at release. I didn't buy it on sale. I waited until it was practically on clearance and I paid a small fraction of the price as to what this actually cost. But now that I have it, I can say that, like, if it would have been more visually pleasing, I would have paid full price because it is truly that bitch. There are only 2 things I don't like about this palette, and neither of them are necessarily a deal breaker to where I would say buy something else. The first, the purples and the reds / pinks stain horrifically. I actually, on this eye, you could probably see underneath is a little darker pink than this one. It isn't because of uneven eye application. It is because my left eye is stained so bad that I look like I have a mixture of like irritation, infection, and I'm healing from a black eye. Now, for me, that isn't a big deal. I can cover it, I can do whatever, but for people who don't like staining, this palette stains pretty bad. Second, the light green and the medium green in the top row, so like not the shimmers, but the first 2 greens in the top row, are basically the same color. You can even see it in my arm swatches. It's kind of this thing that I've complained about in other palettes, that once they're on the eye, you can't tell the difference. Even in the swatches, you can't really tell the difference. So I wish there was a little more depth in that green row. Besides that, the palette is truly phenomenal. The shimmers are impactful, the mattes blend great. You get a little bit of everything from bright colors to deep colors to neutrals, and there's a lot of variety here. You don't just have one neutral shimmer, you get 2. You don't just have one green, you get 2. You can choose to pair orange or pink with the purples and pinks, and I think it works well whether you're going horizontally to create a look, whether you're going vertically to create a look, I feel like the colors just work really well together, and I really like that. I was actually surprised that I ended up ranking this so high because I have used this palette, obviously, but I haven't used every shade before. I would generally grab it and just pick a color here or there, but making myself use every color in here and seeing that every color performed phenomenally, and now that I see that it is made in Italy, that makes a lot of sense. And now we are on to the number 1 palette. We will see if your guesses were correct. I did not think this was going to be number 1. I actually thought She's in Parties was going to be number 1, but we have the original Gemini palette. Look at that. Now I understand this is not everyone's cup of tea. It's a very grungy, earthy type of color story. But I don't have too much to say about this palette besides it's absolutely wonderful, beautiful, phenomenal, amazing. I love it. Now the shade Gemini, which is the Copper Shimmer, will be more of a topper if you do not use a glitter glue. I use glitter glue for everything. If I haven't shown in all the clips every step, I followed the same steps for every palette I used. I primed with the same primer, I used the same brushes, and I always used glitter glue because that's exactly how I would do my makeup on a regular basis. And on my swatches, there was nothing. They were finger swatches, there was nothing on my arm, I didn't go over it more than once. I just wanted to show what a single basic swatch looked like. Now, I will say I recommend a glitter glue, no matter what brand you're using, because it just makes the look more impactful, like the one I'm using today. I don't know that it would have been this vibrant if I had not used a glitter glue. Bonnie the black is not the most amazing black I have ever used. However, I will say it is incredibly beginner friendly because it can be built up to be a good black, but it doesn't start out too scary. It definitely needs to be built up, but I think that's amazing for people who are intimidated by black or aren't as well versed in eyeshadow, so they don't know quite what to do with it, because black can really make or break the whole look. So you don't want to go overboard if you don't know what you're doing. And then even those of us who do know what we're doing, sometimes we get a little heavy-handed. But this was my number 1. So let me know in the comments what your number 1 melt palette was, or if you guessed correctly when you guessed what my number 1 was. I do plan to fill out my melt collection this year and get the ones that I don't have that I can get. Forever lusting after the Beetlejuice palettes that I missed. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time.